Let me take you to the early 8th century, to a moment when the fate of Europe hung in the balance, when two empires collided at the walls of the greatest city in Christendom, and when a siege that lasted through brutal winter and scorching summer would determine whether Western civilization as we know it would survive. This is the complete story of the Great Siege of Constantinople in 717–718, a battle that stopped the Islamic conquest of Europe, saved the Byzantine Empire from destruction, and altered the course of world history. Our story begins not with the siege itself, but with the unstoppable force that made it inevitable. In the century following the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, Arab Muslim armies had achieved conquests that rivaled anything in human history. They had swept out of Arabia with extraordinary speed, driven by religious fervor, military brilliance, and the weakness of the empires they faced. Within decades, they had conquered an area stretching from Persia to Spain, from the edges of India to the shores of the Atlantic. The two great powers that had dominated the medieval world for centuries, the Byzantine Empire and Sasanian Persia, both fell before this whirlwind. Persia was completely destroyed, its Zoroastrian religion displaced by Islam, its territories absorbed into the rapidly expanding Caliphate. The Byzantine Empire, though it survived, was devastated. Egypt, the breadbasket that fed Constantinople, was lost in 642. Syria, including Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christianity, fell in the 630s. North Africa was gradually conquered through the late 7th century. The Mediterranean, which Romans had called our sea, was becoming an Islamic lake. By the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate ruling from Damascus was the largest empire since Rome. It controlled more territory than the Roman Empire at its height. Its armies seemed invincible. Its fleets dominated the seas. Its wealth, drawn from controlling the trade routes between East and West, was immense, and its ambitions were unlimited. Constantinople stood as the last barrier. The city, founded by Constantine the Great in 330 as the New Rome, had survived for nearly 4 centuries as the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It controlled the straits between Europe and Asia, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, making it the key to controlling traffic between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Its massive walls, built in the 5th century by Emperor Theodosius II, had never been breached. Its population, perhaps 500,000 people, made it one of the world's largest cities. Its wealth, accumulated through centuries of trade and taxation, was legendary. But Constantinople was not merely economically and strategically important. It was symbolic. It represented Christian civilization's survival against the Islamic tide. It was the heir to Rome, preserving Roman law, Greek learning, and Christian faith. If Constantinople fell, nothing would stand between the Caliphate and the conquest of Europe. The Balkans, Greece, Italy, and potentially all of Western Europe would lie open to Muslim armies that had already conquered Spain and were raiding into France. The Byzantines understood this clearly. They had fought the Arabs for decades, losing battle after battle, watching province after province torn away. They had seen Arab fleets appear in the Sea of Marmara, threatening Constantinople itself. They knew that the Caliphate viewed Constantinople's conquest as a religious duty. Muslim tradition held that the Prophet himself had blessed the army that would conquer the city. Capturing Constantinople was not merely strategic but spiritual, a sign of divine favor. The Byzantines also knew they were weak. The empire had been racked by internal conflicts. A series of weak or incompetent emperors had squandered resources and failed to effectively resist Arab advances. The theme system, the military administrative structure that provided defense, was under strain. The army had suffered defeats that destroyed not just men but morale. The navy, though still formidable, faced an enemy that had rapidly developed its own naval power. Religious conflicts further weakened the empire. The iconoclast controversy, a bitter dispute about whether religious images should be venerated or destroyed, divided Byzantine society. Emperors, church officials, monks, and ordinary citizens fought bitterly over doctrine while external enemies threatened survival. This internal division distracted from external defense and weakened social cohesion at the moment when unity was most needed. In 715, the Byzantine throne was in chaos. Emperor Anastasius II had been overthrown by Theodosius III, a tax collector who had been reluctantly proclaimed emperor by rebellious troops. Theodosius III had no military experience, no political base, and no apparent qualifications for rule, except that soldiers had put the purple robe on him. The empire was effectively leaderless at its moment of greatest peril. In Damascus, the Umayyad Caliph Sulayman ibn Abd al-Malik watched Byzantine weakness with satisfaction. He was determined to succeed where his predecessors had failed. Previous attempts to capture Constantinople, particularly the lengthy siege from 674 to 678, had ended in disaster. Arab fleets had been destroyed by Greek fire, the mysterious incendiary weapon that could burn on water and which Byzantines guarded as their most valuable military secret. Arab armies had been forced to withdraw with heavy losses. But Sulayman believed circumstances had changed. The Byzantines were weaker than ever, divided internally and led by an incompetent emperor. The caliphate was at the height of its power, its resources seemingly unlimited. Sulayman assembled the largest invasion force ever directed at Constantinople. The army, commanded by his brother Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, numbered perhaps 120,000 men, including Arab cavalry, Syrian infantry, Egyptian troops, and Levites from across the caliphate. The fleet, commanded by Sulayman himself initially and then by various admirals, consisted of perhaps 1,800 ships carrying another 80,000 men and siege equipment. This was not a raid but an invasion. The plan was simple. The army would cross into Thrace and march overland to Constantinople, besieging the city from the landward side. The fleet would sail through the Dardanelles and the Sea of Marmara, blockading the city from the sea. Caught between army and navy, cut off from supplies, Constantinople would be starved into submission. Once the city fell, all Europe would lie open. The army began moving in the summer of 717, crossing from Asia Minor into Thrace. The fleet assembled in Syria and Egypt, gathering ships and supplies for the greatest naval expedition the Islamic world had yet launched. Everything was ready. The largest army and fleet the caliphate could assemble were converging on Constantinople. The stage was set for the siege that would determine whether Christian Europe would survive or whether, like Persia, Egypt, Syria, and North Africa before it, it would be absorbed into the house of Islam. Chapter 2: The General on the Throne. As the Arab forces assembled for their assault on Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire did something unexpected. They found a leader equal to the crisis. His name was Leo, and he would become known to history as Leo III the Isaurian, though he was not actually from Isauria. He was one of history's most remarkable figures, a military commander who seized the throne at the empire's darkest hour and proved to be exactly what the desperate situation required. Leo's background was humble. He was born around 685 in Syria, possibly to a family that had recently migrated from Armenia. Details of his early life are murky, obscured by later propaganda both praising and condemning him. What is clear is that he rose through military ranks through competence and courage, serving on the eastern frontier where Byzantines and Arabs fought constant skirmishes. He understood Arab military tactics from years of fighting them. He spoke Arabic. He knew their strengths and, critically, their weaknesses. By 717, Leo commanded the Anatolic theme, one of the Byzantine Empire's most important military districts. He had proven himself an effective commander and administrator. More importantly, he possessed the ruthless political skill necessary to navigate Byzantine court politics. When he observed the gathering Arab invasion force and the empire's hapless leadership, he made a calculation. The empire needed a real emperor, a military leader who could organize effective resistance. The current emperor, Theodosius III, was clearly inadequate. Leo decided he would be that leader. In March 717, Leo marched his forces toward Constantinople. Theodosius III, recognizing both his own inadequacy and the impossibility of resisting Leo, negotiated his abdication. On March 25, 717, Leo III was crowned emperor in Constantinople's magnificent Hagia Sophia Cathedral. He had seized the throne through a combination of military force and political maneuvering, but unlike many usurpers, he actually possessed the ability to rule effectively. Leo immediately began preparing Constantinople for siege. He understood time was short. Arab forces were already moving. He had perhaps 4 months before they arrived to organize defenses, stockpile supplies, and prepare the population for the ordeal ahead. Those 4 months would prove crucial. First, Leo ensured adequate food supplies. Constantinople needed to withstand potentially years of siege. He gathered grain from Thrace and the remaining Byzantine territories in Asia Minor, stockpiling enough food to feed the city through extended blockade. He organized rationing systems and ensured equitable distribution. Grain warehouses were filled, cisterns were checked and repaired to ensure water supply, and inventories were taken of all resources. Second, Leo strengthened the city's formidable defenses. Constantinople's walls were already the strongest in the world. The Theodosian Walls, built in the early 5th century, consisted of a massive triple defensive system: an outer wall, an inner wall that was even higher and thicker, and a moat. The walls stretched for miles, from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, making Constantinople nearly impregnable from the landward side. Leo ensured these walls were in perfect repair, stockpiled weapons and ammunition, and assigned troops to defensive positions. Third, Leo organized the military forces available. Constantinople's garrison was supplemented by troops Leo brought from Anatolia. He organized the city's able-bodied male population into militia units for support roles. He ensured the navy was prepared, and that Greek fire, the mysterious weapon that had saved Constantinople in previous sieges, was available in quantity. The formula for Greek fire was a closely guarded state secret, known to only a few individuals. Leo ensured production continued, and that operators were trained. Fourth, Leo addressed morale. Constantinople's population was frightened. They remembered the previous Arab siege that had lasted years. They knew the size of the approaching enemy forces. Leo needed to inspire confidence that the city could survive. He made public appearances, addressed crowds, performed religious ceremonies, and projected an image of strength and determination. He presented himself as God's chosen defender of Christendom, the emperor who would save the city where others had failed. He also engaged in diplomatic preparations. He sent messages to Constantinople's potential allies, particularly the Bulgars, a Turkic people who had established a powerful kingdom north of the Byzantine Empire. The Bulgars were pagans, often hostile to Byzantium, but Leo understood that they might be persuaded to attack Arab forces besieging Constantinople. He offered alliance, suggesting the mutual benefit of preventing Arab conquest. These diplomatic seeds would later bear fruit. By summer 717, Leo had transformed Constantinople from a frightened city led by an incompetent emperor into a fortress commanded by a capable military leader and prepared for the worst. The population, while still fearful, had confidence they had not possessed months earlier. The walls were strong, the supplies were adequate, and the leadership was competent. Constantinople was as ready as it could be when the Arab forces arrived. Maslama's army crossed into Thrace in July 717, advancing toward Constantinople with overwhelming force. The march was deliberate and methodical. Maslama was an experienced commander who understood that taking Constantinople would not be easy. He had been present during the earlier failed siege in the 670s and knew the challenges. But he also knew his army was larger and better supplied than any previous force sent against the city. On August 15, 717, the Arab army arrived before Constantinople's land walls. Maslama established his camp and assessed the defenses. What he saw was daunting. The Theodosian Walls rose before him, massive and seemingly impregnable. Behind them lay a city that had withstood sieges for centuries. But Maslama had time, resources, and confidence. He settled in for a long siege, building permanent camps, establishing supply lines, and preparing siege equipment. The Arab fleet was supposed to arrive simultaneously, completing the blockade and preventing supplies from reaching Constantinople by sea. But here the first problem emerged. The fleet, commanded initially by Caliph Suleiman himself, was delayed by storms and logistical problems. When it finally approached the Dardanelles in September 717, it faced an unexpected obstacle. Leo had prepared a reception. Byzantine ships equipped with Greek fire awaited the Arab fleet in the narrow straits. More devastatingly, Leo had secretly communicated with the Christian crews of some Arab ships, many of whom were Egyptian Copts or Syrian Christians forced to serve the Caliphate. He offered them refuge and freedom if they defected. When the fleets engaged, chaos erupted. Some Arab ships turned against their companions. Greek fire wreaked havoc in the confined waters. Ships burned and sank. The Arab fleet broke apart, with some ships managing to reach the Sea of Marmara while others fled back to the Mediterranean. This naval disaster was the siege's first turning point. The Arab fleet had been significantly weakened before even beginning its blockade. More critically, the defections demonstrated that not all the Caliphate's subjects were loyal Muslims willing to die for the cause. The Christians within the Caliphate's territories could be turned against it, a weakness Leo would continue exploiting. The Arabs who reached the Sea of Marmara attempted to blockade Constantinople from the sea, but they were too few and too badly damaged to be fully effective. Byzantine ships could still slip through, bringing in supplies and maintaining contact with Byzantine territories across the Bosphorus. The complete blockade Maslama had planned was impossible. Constantinople could be resupplied, at least partially, by sea. As autumn arrived, the siege settled into routine. Maslama's army periodically assaulted the land walls, testing defenses and seeking weak points. These attacks were repulsed with relative ease. The Theodosian Walls had been designed to withstand assault, and they did their job. The Arab siege equipment, which might have been effective against lesser fortifications, proved inadequate against Constantinople's massive walls. Meanwhile, inside the city, Leo organized effective defense while maintaining morale. The population endured hardships, food was rationed, but discipline held. Leo's visible leadership and the success in repulsing attacks maintained confidence. Constantinople had survived worse sieges before and would survive this one. As 717 turned to 718, both sides settled in for a test of endurance. The Arabs hoped to starve Constantinople into submission. The Byzantines hoped to outlast the siege until the Arab supplies ran out or some external factor forced them to withdraw. Everything depended on who could endure longer. The real ordeal was just beginning. Chapter 3: The Winter of Despair. The winter of 717-718 became legendary for its brutal severity. Chroniclers described it as one of the coldest winters in memory, with snow piling high, temperatures plunging far below freezing, and conditions becoming almost unbearable for both besiegers and besieged. But while Constantinople's population, protected by walls and sheltered in buildings with adequate food stores, suffered in relative comfort, the Arab army outside the walls faced catastrophe. Maslama's army had prepared for a long siege, but not for the winter they encountered. Arab soldiers, most from warm climates of Syria, Arabia, and Egypt, had never experienced such cold. Their tents provided inadequate shelter against freezing winds and heavy snow. Their clothing was insufficient for the conditions. Firewood became scarce as nearby forests were consumed, and bringing supplies from distant areas became increasingly difficult through the snow. Food shortages compounded the misery. The Arab army depended on supplies brought from Syria and Egypt by sea and overland through hostile territory. The naval disasters in the Dardanelles had disrupted sea supply lines. Byzantine raids harassed overland supply columns. Winter weather made transportation difficult. The massive army, perhaps still numbering 100,000 men despite losses, consumed enormous quantities of food that became increasingly difficult to provide. As winter deepened, Arab soldiers began dying, not from Byzantine weapons but from exposure, hunger, and disease. The cold killed hundreds, then thousands. Dysentery and other diseases spread through the camps where sanitation deteriorated. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried in the frozen ground. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized they might die not in glorious battle but miserably in the cold, far from home, besieging a city that seemed impossible to capture. Some soldiers attempted desertion, fleeing toward Byzantine lines and begging to be taken prisoner. Leo accepted these defectors, gaining intelligence about conditions in the Arab camp while demonstrating to his own people that the enemy was suffering worse than they were. These defectors described the horrors in Maslama's camp: men huddling together for warmth, eating animals that had died from cold or disease, burning equipment and wooden fortifications for fuel. Maslama struggled to maintain discipline and morale. He was an experienced commander who had faced difficulties before, but this was unprecedented. He ordered strict rationing, sent desperate messages to Damascus requesting supplies and reinforcements, and tried to keep his army together through appeals to religious duty and promises that spring would bring relief. He executed deserters and severely punished any talk of abandoning the siege. His determination was admirable, but determination alone could not make crops grow in winter or warm, freezing soldiers. Inside Constantinople, conditions were difficult but manageable. Leo's stockpiling had ensured adequate food supplies. The city's cisterns provided water. Buildings offered shelter. The population, though restricted by rationing and fearful of what spring might bring, at least survived in relative safety. Leo maintained discipline through a combination of effective administration and religious appeals. He led religious processions, invoking divine protection, reminding citizens they defended not merely a city but Christian civilization itself. The Byzantine navy, protected in the Golden Horn behind a massive chain that prevented enemy ships from entering, remained operational. Byzantine ships could slip through the weakened Arab blockade to gather supplies from the Black Sea coast and remaining Byzantine territories. This maritime access, which Maslama's naval disasters had failed to fully cut, proved crucial. Constantinople was not completely isolated as the Arabs had planned. As winter continued, Leo received promising news. His diplomatic overtures to the Bulgars were succeeding. The Bulgar Khan Tervel, recognizing both the threat an Arab-controlled Constantinople would pose and the opportunity to gain Byzantine gratitude and concessions, agreed to attack Arab forces. In the spring of 718, Bulgar armies would strike at Maslama's supply lines and rear areas. This Bulgarian alliance was strategically brilliant. Leo had understood that while Constantinople's walls might hold, relieving the siege required external assistance. The Bulgars, fierce warriors who had defeated Byzantine armies in the past, represented a formidable force that could threaten Arab positions outside Constantinople, while the garrison defended from within. The Arabs would face enemies from two directions, stretching their already strained resources further. February 718 brought further good news to Constantinople. A second Arab fleet, sent to reinforce and resupply the besiegers, attempted to reach the Sea of Marmara. This fleet, consisting of hundreds of ships carrying supplies and Egyptian and North African troops, represented the Caliphate's attempt to salvage the failing siege. If it reached Constantinople successfully, it might provide the reinforcements and supplies necessary to continue the siege through another year. But the fleet met disaster in the Dardanelles. Byzantine ships equipped with Greek fire attacked in the narrow straits where Arab vessels had little room to maneuver. The mysterious fire, which could burn on water and which could not be extinguished by conventional means, proved devastating. Ships caught fire, creating panic. In the confined waters, burning vessels collided with others, spreading the flames. The Arab fleet was destroyed, losing hundreds of ships and thousands of men. This second naval disaster was catastrophic for the Arab siege. The supplies and reinforcements that might have sustained the siege for another year were lost. More critically, the psychological impact was immense. Arab commanders and soldiers realized that control of the sea, essential for supplying forces besieging a city with sea access, was impossible. Greek fire rendered the Byzantines effectively invincible in naval warfare, at least in confined waters where it could be deployed most effectively. As spring arrived, the Arab army's condition was desperate. Perhaps half the original force had died from cold, hunger, disease, or in sporadic fighting. The survivors were demoralized, weakened, and questioning whether Constantinople could ever be taken. They had expected a relatively quick campaign, perhaps a single season of siege ending in either victory or negotiated withdrawal. Instead, they had endured months of hell, losing comrades to miserable deaths, achieving nothing. Maslama recognized reality. The siege had failed. His army was dying. No reinforcements would arrive. Byzantine defenses remained unbreached. Continuing the siege would only result in more deaths without any possibility of success. The greatest invasion ever launched by the Caliphate had been defeated not by superior Byzantine military power but by logistics, weather, and Byzantine resilience. In Damascus, Caliph Sulayman had died in September 717, just as the siege was beginning. His successor, Umayyad, was more focused on religious reform and consolidation than on expensive military adventures. He gave Maslama permission to withdraw if conditions were untenable. Maslama needed no further encouragement. Chapter 4: The Retreat and Its Consequences. In August 718, after nearly a year of siege, Maslama ordered withdrawal. The decision was militarily necessary but politically and psychologically devastating. The greatest army the Caliphate had ever assembled, blessed by religious leaders as the force that would fulfill prophecy by conquering Constantinople, was retreating in failure. The withdrawal became almost as disastrous as the siege itself. Maslama organized the retreat carefully, but careful organization could not overcome the fundamental problems his army faced. The soldiers were weakened by a year of privation. The horses had died or been eaten. Equipment had been abandoned or destroyed for fuel. The army that had arrived in overwhelming strength departed as a shadow of itself. The Bulgars, fulfilling their agreement with Leo, attacked the retreating Arabs. Bulgar cavalry harassed the columns, picking off stragglers, ambushing supply wagons, and inflicting casualties on an army too weak to effectively resist. Byzantine forces also emerged from Constantinople to attack the rearguard. The retreat became a running battle through Thrace, with the Arabs suffering losses daily. The remnants of the Arab fleet attempted to return to Syria and Egypt, but disaster struck again. Storms in the Aegean Sea scattered and sank many ships. Others were intercepted by Byzantine vessels. Some crews, despairing of ever reaching home, mutinied and attempted to surrender to Byzantine ports. Of the massive fleet that had set out, perhaps only a few dozen ships reached home safely. The losses were staggering. Of the approximately 200,000 men who had participated in the siege between army and navy, perhaps only 30,000 returned home. The rest had died in winter camps, burned in naval battles, drowned in storms, or been killed during the retreat. This casualty rate, around 85%, was virtually unprecedented for a military expedition of this scale. Entire regions of the Caliphate had sent their young men to conquer Constantinople. Few returned. Maslama himself survived and returned to Damascus, where he faced no official punishment. He had followed orders and done his best in impossible circumstances. Caliph Umayyad, a pious and relatively moderate ruler, recognized that the failure resulted from overambition and bad luck rather than incompetence. Maslama continued serving the caliphate, though he never again commanded such a large force or attempted such an ambitious operation. The immediate strategic consequences were profound. The Byzantine Empire, which had appeared on the brink of destruction, had survived. Constantinople remained the Christian capital, the barrier between Islamic expansion and Europe. The caliphate's aura of invincibility was shattered. Arab armies were not unstoppable. They could be defeated by proper preparation, good leadership, and exploiting their weaknesses. Byzantium's survival ensured Christian Europe's survival. If Constantinople had fallen in 718, nothing would have prevented Arab armies from advancing through the Balkans into Central Europe. Greece would certainly have fallen. Italy, already threatened by Muslim forces in Sicily, would have faced invasion from two directions. The Frankish kingdoms of Western Europe, divided and militarily inferior, would have struggled to resist the full force of the caliphate. The siege's failure also had profound effects on the Islamic world. The caliphate had overextended itself. The massive resources devoted to the failed siege could have been used elsewhere. The loss of so many men weakened the caliphate militarily and demographically. Regions that had provided troops faced labor shortages and economic disruption as communities mourned lost sons and brothers. Psychologically, the defeat affected Islamic confidence. Previous Muslim conquests had been achieved with remarkable speed and apparent divine favor. Cities fell, empires collapsed, and Islam spread with what seemed like providential inevitability. Constantinople's successful resistance suggested limits to expansion. If the greatest Muslim army ever assembled could not take the city, perhaps it was not meant to be conquered. This psychological shift, subtle but real, reduced the aggressive expansionism that had characterized the first century of Islamic history. The caliphate did not abandon its ambitions toward Byzantium entirely. Arab raids into Asia Minor continued for decades. Naval forces occasionally threatened Byzantine territories, but never again did the caliphate attempt conquest on the scale of the 717–718 siege. The focus shifted from conquering Constantinople to consolidating control over already conquered territories and managing internal affairs of the vast empire. For Leo III, the successful defense brought immense prestige and political legitimacy. He had seized power through military force, but his success in saving Constantinople from the greatest threat it had ever faced made his rule acceptable to Byzantines who might otherwise have opposed a usurper. He had proven himself God's chosen emperor, the leader who had saved Christian civilization. This political capital allowed him to implement controversial policies, particularly his later iconoclasm, with less opposition than a less successful emperor would have faced. Leo used the breathing space the siege's failure provided to rebuild Byzantine power. He reformed the military, strengthened the theme system that provided provincial defense, and stabilized the empire's finances. He reorganized administration to make government more efficient. He issued the Ecloga, a legal code that simplified Byzantine law and made it more accessible. These reforms, undertaken in the years following the siege, strengthened the empire and helped it survive for another 7 centuries. The siege also had cultural and religious consequences. Constantinople's survival was interpreted throughout Christian Europe as divine intervention. God had protected the Christian capital from the infidel onslaught. This interpretation strengthened Christian identity and religious confidence at a time when Islamic military success had caused some Christians to question their faith. The victory could be presented as proof that Christianity, not Islam, had divine favor. The Byzantine Church commemorated the siege's end with religious celebrations. Icons allegedly miraculous in protecting the city during the siege were venerated. Religious processions celebrated the Virgin Mary's protection of Constantinople, which tradition credited with saving the city. These religious interpretations, while perhaps not capturing the material factors that actually determine the outcome, were psychologically important in maintaining morale and social cohesion. In Western Europe, news of Constantinople's successful resistance brought relief mixed with limited comprehension of what had been at stake. Western Europeans, divided into small kingdoms and increasingly isolated from the Eastern Mediterranean world, did not fully understand how close they had come to facing Islamic invasion from the east as well as from Muslim Spain in the west. But they recognized that a great Christian victory had been won, and that a great threat had been turned back. The Franks in particular would benefit from Constantinople's survival, though they might not have recognized it at the time. In 732, 14 years after Constantinople's siege ended, Frankish forces under Charles Martel would defeat an Arab raiding force at the Battle of Tours in central France, an engagement often portrayed as saving Christian Europe from Muslim conquest. But Tours was a relatively small battle against a raiding party. The truly decisive engagement, the battle that actually saved Europe from serious Islamic invasion, had been fought at Constantinople's walls in 717–718. Historians debate counterfactuals, but it seems reasonable to suggest that if Constantinople had fallen in 718, European history would have been fundamentally different. The Balkans would have become Islamic. Italian city-states would have faced overwhelming pressure. The cultural transmission from classical antiquity through Byzantium to Renaissance Europe might never have occurred. The Western European kingdoms, isolated and weak, might eventually have been absorbed into an Islamic empire stretching from Spain to the Balkans. Instead, Europe survived as Christian civilization, eventually growing strong enough to launch the Crusades, to experience the Renaissance, to develop the scientific revolution, and to spread European culture worldwide through colonialism. All of these developments, for better or worse, depended on Christian Europe surviving in the 8th century, and that survival was secured not at Tours but at Constantinople's walls. Chapter 5: Leo the Reformer. The years following the siege revealed Leo III as more than merely a successful general. He proved to be one of the most consequential Byzantine emperors, a reformer whose policies shaped the empire for generations. The siege had given him political legitimacy and breathing space. Now he used both to transform Byzantine governance, military organization, and ultimately, religious practice in ways that would prove deeply controversial. Leo's first priority was military reform. The siege had exposed both strengths and weaknesses in Byzantine defense. The walls had held, the navy had performed brilliantly with Greek fire, and Leo's leadership had been effective. But the empire's broader military situation remained precarious. Arab raids continued into Asia Minor. The Balkans faced threats from Bulgars and Slavic tribes. Byzantine military forces needed reorganization to meet these continuing challenges. Leo strengthened the theme system, the military administrative structure that formed the backbone of Byzantine defense. Under this system, provinces called themes were governed by military commanders called strategoi who held both military and civilian authority. Soldiers were granted land in exchange for military service, creating a class of farmer soldiers who had personal stakes in defending their territories. This system made the empire less dependent on expensive mercenaries and created a more sustainable defensive structure. Leo expanded the theme system, creating new themes in threatened areas and ensuring each had adequate resources and manpower. He standardized military organization, improved training, and ensured that soldiers were properly equipped and paid. These reforms required money, which Leo found through tax reform and more efficient administration. He cracked down on corruption, streamlined bureaucracy, and ensured that tax revenue actually reached the imperial treasury rather than disappearing into officials' pockets. The Ecloga, Leo's legal code issued in 726, represented another major reform. Byzantine law had become complex and inaccessible, based on the massive legal compilations of Justinian I from the 6th century. These texts, written in Latin and filled with obsolete provisions, were incomprehensible to most judges and ordinary citizens. Leo simplified the law, issuing a handbook in Greek that covered criminal law, family law, and military law in accessible language. The Ecloga was more than legal simplification. It reflected Leo's Christian values and his vision of imperial justice. Punishments were made more humane in some cases, with mutilation replacing execution for certain crimes. This might seem harsh by modern standards, but it represented a reduction in severity compared to earlier practice. The code emphasized protecting the poor and vulnerable, regulating marriage and family relationships, and ensuring justice was accessible to all rather than only to the wealthy and educated. Leo's financial reforms stabilized imperial finances. He reformed the coinage, ensuring that Byzantine gold coins maintained their value and remained the standard currency of Mediterranean trade. He regulated markets, prevented hoarding and speculation, and ensured adequate food supplies for Constantinople. These economic policies, while not revolutionary, were competently executed and helped restore prosperity after the disruption caused by the siege and preceding decades of instability. Diplomatically, Leo maintained the alliance with Bulgaria that had proven so valuable during the siege. Khan Tervel received territory, tribute, and the prestigious Byzantine title of Caesar, making him theoretically second only to the emperor in imperial hierarchy. This alliance secured Constantinople's European flank and ensured that future Arab threats would not find willing allies in the Balkans. The relationship was not always smooth, but it generally held, providing security on one frontier while threats continued on others. Leo also attempted diplomatic outreach to Western Europe, particularly to the Franks and to the papacy in Rome. These relationships were complicated by religious and political differences. The Western Church was increasingly independent of Byzantine control, following its own path under papal leadership. The Franks, while nominally Christian, were semi-barbarous by Byzantine standards and pursuing their own political interests. Nevertheless, Leo understood the value of maintaining connections with Western Christendom, both for diplomatic reasons and to prevent Western territories from falling to Muslim Spain. But Leo's most controversial legacy concerned religion. In 726, approximately 8 years after the siege ended, Leo began the movement known as iconoclasm, the breaking of icons. This policy, which banned the veneration of religious images and ordered the destruction of icons throughout the empire, would dominate Byzantine politics for over a century and create a permanent rift between Eastern and Western Christianity. Leo's motivations for iconoclasm remain debated by historians. Contemporary sources, written by iconoclast enemies, portray Leo as heretical, influenced by Islam and Judaism, both of which prohibited religious images, or simply tyrannical. Modern historians suggest more complex motivations. Leo may have genuinely believed icon veneration was idolatrous, violating biblical commandments against graven images. He may have seen icons as sources of superstition and corruption, with monasteries growing wealthy from pilgrims visiting miracle-working images. Political considerations also played a role. The Orthodox Church, particularly monasteries, had accumulated enormous wealth and land, creating a powerful institution that sometimes challenged imperial authority. Iconoclasm provided a pretext for confiscating church property and reasserting imperial control over religious affairs. Additionally, the empire's military classes, particularly those from Asia Minor's frontier regions where soldiers fought constantly against Muslims, were often sympathetic to iconoclasm, seeing icon veneration as a weakness that distinguished true Christianity from the idolatry practiced in popular religion. Whatever Leo's motivations, iconoclasm proved divisive. The policy had significant support, particularly among military elites and some bishops who saw theological justification for banning images. but opposition was fierce. Monks, who produced icons and whose monasteries profited from pilgrim traffic, were naturally hostile. Much of the urban population, particularly in Constantinople, where icons played important roles in popular religious practice, opposed the policy. Women, who played significant roles in private devotion, and for whom icons were important religious objects, were often opponents. The papacy in Rome vehemently opposed iconoclasm. Pope Gregory II condemned Leo's policy and threatened excommunication. This created a permanent rupture between Constantinople and Rome, accelerating the split between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic Christianity that would become official in 1054. The papacy, previously theoretically subject to the Byzantine emperor, increasingly asserted independence and looked to Frankish kings, rather than Byzantine emperors for political alliance and protection. Leo enforced iconoclasm through imperial authority. Icons were removed from churches, painted over or destroyed. Monasteries that resisted faced closure or confiscation. Bishops who opposed the policy were removed from office. This created resentment and resistance, including occasional riots and, in some provinces, open rebellion. Leo suppressed opposition effectively but at the cost of social unity. The siege's successful defense had given Leo the political capital to pursue such controversial policies. A less successful emperor would have faced overwhelming opposition. But Leo's prestige as the savior of Constantinople and Christianity allowed him to implement iconoclasm despite its unpopularity in many quarters. His military and administrative competence meant that even those who hated iconoclasm often reluctantly supported him, because he provided effective governance and defense. Leo died in 741, having ruled for 24 years. His son Constantine V succeeded him and continued iconoclasm even more vigorously. Leo's legacy was thus mixed. He had saved the empire from destruction, reformed its administration and military, and provided capable leadership during a critical period. But he had also initiated a religious controversy that divided Byzantine society, created lasting enmity with the Western Church, and consumed political energy that might have been better spent on external threats. Chapter 6. The Arab World After Defeat. While Byzantium recovered under Leo's leadership, the Arab world struggled with the aftermath of defeat. The failed siege of Constantinople had consequences that rippled through the caliphate for decades, contributing to internal conflicts that would ultimately fragment the Islamic empire and end the Umayyad dynasty's rule. The immediate impact was demographic and economic. Entire communities across the caliphate had lost their young men. Syrian villages that had sent soldiers returned few or none. Egyptian communities mourned sons who had served on ships destroyed by Greek fire or storms. Arabian tribes that had provided cavalry received back only remnants of the forces they had contributed. This loss of manpower affected agriculture, trade, and military strength across the empire. The economic cost was staggering. The expedition had consumed enormous resources: ships built, equipment manufactured, supplies gathered, soldiers paid and equipped. All of this investment had produced nothing except casualties. The caliphate's treasury, which had seemed unlimited, was depleted. Taxes increased to compensate, creating resentment among populations already bearing heavy fiscal burdens. Trade routes were disrupted. Agricultural production fell due to labor shortages, and economic growth that had characterized earlier decades of Islamic expansion stalled. Politically, the defeat damaged the Umayyad Caliphate's legitimacy. The Umayyads, an Arab aristocratic family that had controlled the caliphate since 661, had justified their rule partly through military success and territorial expansion. They were the dynasty that had conquered North Africa, Spain, Central Asia, and had pushed to the gates of Constantinople itself. Defeat suggested they had lost divine favor, a serious charge in a religious state where political legitimacy derived partly from perceived godliness. The Umayyads faced increasing opposition from several sources. The Kharijites, a puritanical Islamic sect that rejected any leadership not chosen through community consensus and that opposed hereditary rule, used the defeat as evidence that the Umayyads were corrupt and ungodly. They launched rebellions across the caliphate, particularly in Arabia and Iraq, attacking Umayyad governors and officials. These rebellions were usually suppressed, but they consumed resources and demonstrated discontent. More seriously, the Abbasids, descendants of the Prophet Muhammad's uncle Abbas, positioned themselves as alternatives to Umayyad rule. They claimed superior religious legitimacy through their family connection to the Prophet. They accused the Umayyads of worldliness, corruption, and abandoning Islamic principles in pursuit of temporal power. The Constantinople disaster provided propaganda material. God had denied the Umayyads victory because they were unworthy. Non-Arab Muslims, particularly Persians, increasingly resented Arab dominance. Early Islamic conquests had promised equality among all Muslims regardless of ethnicity. In practice, the Umayyad Caliphate maintained Arab privilege. Arabs received higher pay, held the best positions, and generally treated non-Arab converts as second-class Muslims. Persians, whose civilization had been ancient and sophisticated when Arabs were desert nomads, particularly resented this subordination. The Constantinople defeat provided opportunities for those opposing Umayyad rule. It demonstrated that the dynasty was not invincible, that its armies could be defeated, and that its ambitions could fail. Opposition groups, previously intimidated by Umayyad power, became bolder. Rebellions increased. Regions attempted to assert independence. The caliphate's internal cohesion, which had seemed solid during the expansion period, began fragmenting. Caliph Umar II, who ruled from 717 to 720, attempted reforms to address these problems. He was pious, relatively moderate, and interested in consolidating rather than expanding the empire. He reduced taxes, stopped forced conversions, and attempted to treat non-Arab Muslims more equitably. He recalled the expeditions against Constantinople and other frontiers, focusing on internal administration rather than external conquest. These policies were wise but politically weak. Critics saw them as admitting defeat, abandoning expansion, and showing weakness. Umar II's early death in 720 ended this reformist period. His successors returned to more traditional Umayyad policies, Arab privilege, heavy taxation, attempts at expansion, but the underlying problems remained. The caliphate was overextended, its resources strained, its subject populations resentful. The failure at Constantinople had revealed these weaknesses without solving them. Military defeats continued. In 732, Charles Martel defeated an Arab raiding force at Tours in France, ending Muslim expansion in Western Europe. While Tours was not as decisive as sometimes portrayed, it was essentially a large raid, not a serious invasion. It represented another check on Islamic expansion. In Central Asia, Turkish peoples resisted incorporation into the caliphate, maintaining independence and occasionally defeating Arab armies. On every frontier, expansion had stalled. The caliphate's attention increasingly turned inward. Rather than conquering new territories, the Umayyads focused on maintaining control over what they already possessed. This required constant military activity, suppressing rebellions, enforcing tax collection, maintaining garrisons in resistant provinces. These internal security operations consumed the resources that had previously funded expansion, creating a cycle where reduced expansion caused internal problems that required resources that might have funded expansion. Culturally and intellectually, the post-Constantinople period saw the caliphate beginning its remarkable achievements in science, philosophy, mathematics, and art. As military expansion slowed, resources and attention shifted to cultural development. Baghdad, which would become the Abbasid capital after 750, began its transformation into a great center of learning. Arabic translations of Greek philosophical and scientific texts commenced. Islamic scholars began the work that would, overcoming centuries, preserve and advance human knowledge. But this cultural flourishing occurred against a backdrop of political instability. The Umayyad Caliphate was slowly coming apart. Provincial governors acted increasingly independently. Regions developed local identities. The unity that had characterized early Islam fragmented into competing movements, sects, and ethnic groups. The caliphate remained powerful, controlling vast territories and resources, but it was no longer the united, expanding force that had terrified Byzantium and threatened Europe. In 747, the Abbasid Revolution began in Khurasan, northeastern Persia. This uprising, carefully planned over years and drawing support from discontented non-Arab Muslims, Shia Muslims who rejected Umayyad legitimacy, and others opposed to the dynasty, spread rapidly across the Eastern Caliphate. Abbasid forces, fighting under black banners and proclaiming themselves champions of justice and true Islam, defeated Umayyad armies in a series of battles. In 750, the last Umayyad Caliph, Marwan II, was defeated and killed. The Abbasids hunted down and executed virtually the entire Umayyad family, eliminating potential rivals. Only a few escaped, including one prince who fled to Spain where he established an independent Umayyad emirate that would later become a caliphate in its own right. The Abbasid Caliphate, ruling from its new capital Baghdad, replaced the Umayyad dynasty that had led Islam for nearly 90 years. The Abbasids presented themselves as correcting Umayyad mistakes. They emphasized Islamic universalism over Arab privilege. They positioned themselves as more pious, more legitimate. But they faced similar challenges, governing an enormous diverse empire, managing religious and ethnic tensions, maintaining military strength, and funding an expensive state apparatus. The problems that had plagued the Umayyads, problems revealed and exacerbated by the Constantinople defeat, continued under new management. The Islamic world thus entered a new phase. The period of rapid military expansion was over. The faith remained vibrant and continued spreading through trade and cultural influence rather than conquest. Islamic civilization began its golden age of cultural achievement. But the unified military colossus that had threatened to conquer the known world was gone, replaced by a fragmented Islamic world of competing dynasties, sects, and regional powers. Constantinople's successful resistance had been a turning point. It had not destroyed Islamic power. The caliphate remained formidable for centuries, but it had marked the end of seemingly unstoppable expansion and had contributed to internal problems that eventually fragmented the Islamic empire. The battle that saved Christian Europe had also, indirectly, shaped the Islamic world's subsequent development. Chapter 7: Byzantine Revival and Survival. The century following the 717–718 siege saw Byzantium transform from a desperate, shrinking empire on the brink of destruction to a revived power capable of defending its territories and occasionally going on the offensive. This revival was not smooth or linear. There were defeats, internal crises, and continuing threats, but the general trajectory was upward. The successful defense of Constantinople provided the foundation for this recovery. The Isaurian dynasty, founded by Leo III, ruled until 802. Leo's son Constantine V, 740–1775, proved even more militarily successful than his father. He launched campaigns into Syria, defeating Arab forces in several battles and temporarily recovering lost territories. He fought successfully against the Bulgars, winning victories that secured the empire's Balkan frontier. He continued his father's iconoclasm, pursuing the policy with even greater vigor and creating lasting resentment among icon venerators. Constantine V's military success rested on the reforms Leo III had initiated. The theme system provided reliable military forces without bankrupting the empire through mercenary payments. The navy maintained control of the seas around Constantinople and could strike at Arab coastal positions. Greek fire remained a technological advantage that enemies could not counter. Effective administration ensured resources were available for military campaigns. The empire remained on the defensive strategically, but could now conduct offensive operations when opportunities arose. Arab raids into Asia Minor continued, and Byzantine raids into Syria and Mesopotamia responded. The frontier was fluid, with neither side capable of decisive conquest, but both able to inflict damage on the other. This military equilibrium, while unstable and violent, was far better than the desperate defense of previous decades when every battle seemed to threaten the empire's existence. Religious controversy continued dominating internal politics. Iconoclasm remained official policy, enforced by emperors who saw it as theologically correct and politically useful. Monasteries were closed or repurposed. Church property was confiscated. Bishops who opposed iconoclasm were removed. This created a permanent opposition that included monks, many ordinary believers, women who found icons important for private devotion, and those who simply disliked imperial interference in religious matters. The conflict with the papacy worsened. Rome condemned iconoclasm and Byzantine emperors with equal vigor. The popes, no longer looking to Constantinople for protection or legitimacy, increasingly allied with Frankish kings. In 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Roman emperor, creating a rival claimant to the title Constantine the Great had established. Byzantines saw this as outrageous. There was only one Roman Empire, and its capital was Constantinople, not Rome. But they could do little about it. The split between Eastern and Western Christianity, already deep, widened further. Empress Irene, 797–802, temporarily restored icon veneration. She came to power as regent for her young son Constantine VI, and eventually had him blinded and deposed to rule in her own right, one of the few women to rule Byzantium as sole emperor rather than through a male relative. She convened the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, which condemned iconoclasm and restored icons. This pleased icon venerators and improved relations with Rome, but it angered the military aristocracy and many bishops who supported iconoclasm. Irene's reign ended in 802 when she was deposed by a palace conspiracy and replaced by Nicephorus I. His reign, 802–811, saw renewed military challenges. The Bulgars under Khan Krum emerged as serious threats. In 811, Krum ambushed and destroyed a Byzantine army, killing Nicephorus I, the first Byzantine emperor killed in battle in centuries. Krum allegedly made Nicephorus's skull into a drinking cup, a gesture illustrating the brutality of Byzantine-Bulgar warfare. The early 9th century brought internal instability. Emperors succeeded each other rapidly through coups and violence. Iconoclasm was restored by Leo V, 813–820, creating renewed religious strife. Military challenges continued on multiple frontiers. The empire seemed again to be slipping toward the chaos that had characterized the pre-Leo III period. But the foundations Leo III had laid remained solid. The theme system survived political turmoil. The navy remained effective. Constantinople's walls stood impregnable. The administration, while disrupted by constant regime changes, continued functioning. These institutional strengths meant that even weak emperors presided over an empire that could defend itself and maintain basic functions. The Amorian dynasty, 828–67, brought some stability. Michael II, 828–29, ended the worst religious persecutions while maintaining official iconoclasm. Theophilos, 829–842, the last iconoclast emperor, proved capable militarily and administratively while pursuing iconoclasm with renewed vigor. His widow Theodora, ruling as regent for their young son Michael III, finally ended iconoclasm permanently in 843. The triumph of orthodoxy, celebrating icon restoration, is still commemorated annually in Orthodox Christianity. The end of iconoclasm allowed religious energies previously consumed by internal controversy to be directed elsewhere. Missionaries spread Orthodox Christianity to the Slavs, creating new Christian communities in the Balkans and eventually Russia. The missionary work of Cyril and Methodius, who created the Cyrillic alphabet to translate Christian texts into Slavic languages, laid foundations for Orthodox Christianity's expansion into Eastern Europe. The Macedonian dynasty, 867–1056, represented Byzantium's Golden Age. Basil I 867–886, who founded the dynasty through murder and palace intrigue, proved an effective ruler. His successors, particularly Basil II 976–1025, achieved military victories that expanded Byzantine territory to its greatest extent since the early 7th century. Byzantine culture flourished. Constantinople remained the richest and most sophisticated city in Europe. Byzantine gold coins were the international currency of trade. But this revival occurred more than a century after the siege of 717–718. The siege had not immediately transformed Byzantium from desperate weakness to confident strength. Rather, it had provided the breathing space necessary for gradual recovery. It had demonstrated that the empire could survive its worst threats. It had provided political legitimacy to emperors who used that legitimacy to implement reforms. It had given Byzantium time to adapt to its reduced circumstances, to develop strategies for survival in a hostile world, and eventually to revive. The themes established or strengthened after the siege formed the backbone of Byzantine military power for centuries. The navy that had deployed Greek fire so effectively in 718 continued controlling the waters around Constantinople and projecting power throughout the Mediterranean. The walls that had held against Maslama's army continued protecting Constantinople until 1204, when they were breached not by Muslims but by crusaders from Western Europe in one of history's great betrayals. Constantinople itself remained the empire's greatest asset. Its population, wealth, and strategic position made it irreplaceable. Its fall would mean the empire's end, as finally occurred in 1453 when Ottoman Turks conquered the city using cannons that could breach walls that had stood for 1,000 years. But for over 7 centuries after 717–718, Constantinople stood as the capital of Christian civilization in the East, a beacon of learning, art, and faith, a city that had survived humanity's greatest siege. Chapter 8: The Military Legacy. The Siege of Constantinople produced lessons in military strategy, tactics, logistics, and fortification that influenced warfare for centuries. Military commanders studied the siege, learning both from Byzantine success and Arab failure. The campaign demonstrated principles of war that remain relevant: the importance of logistics, the value of defensive fortifications, the challenges of amphibious operations, and the decisive role of technology. The most obvious lesson concerned fortifications. Constantinople's walls had proven their worth. The Theodosian Walls, built in the early 5th century, had withstood a year-long siege by a massive army equipped with siege engines and unlimited determination. They had not been breached, climbed, or undermined. They had done exactly what walls were meant to do: make the city impregnable to direct assault. This success influenced fortification design across Europe and the Mediterranean. Cities studied Constantinople's defensive system and attempted to replicate its features: multiple defensive lines creating defense in depth, moats to prevent siege towers from approaching walls, towers positioned to provide flanking fire on attackers, walls thick enough to resist battering rams and catapults. Medieval castle design drew heavily on Byzantine principles demonstrated at Constantinople. The wall's success also demonstrated that fortifications remained militarily relevant despite advances in siege technology. Some military theorists had argued that improved siege engines, particularly Arab innovations in catapult design, had made walls obsolete. Constantinople proved otherwise. Well-designed fortifications, adequately garrisoned and competently defended, could withstand siege indefinitely. This validated the enormous expense of building and maintaining fortifications and encouraged cities throughout Europe to invest in defensive walls. Greek fire received renewed attention. This mysterious weapon, which had destroyed Arab fleets in 717–718, was recognized as a decisive military technology that could offset numerical inferiority. Byzantine authorities maintained strict secrecy around Greek fire's formula, treating it as the most valuable military secret the empire possessed. Modern historians remain uncertain about Greek fire's exact composition. Various theories suggest combinations of petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and other ingredients, but its effectiveness was undeniable. Greek fire demonstrated the importance of technological advantage in warfare. A fleet equipped with Greek fire could defeat larger forces that lacked equivalent weapons. This lesson influenced military thinking about technology's role. Nations sought to develop unique weapons that would provide decisive advantages. They also sought to steal or discover enemies' technological secrets, just as numerous foreign powers attempted, usually unsuccessfully, to learn Greek fire's formula. Naval warfare lessons were equally important. The Arab fleet's destruction demonstrated the challenges of amphibious operations against a prepared defender. Naval forces required not just ships, but also training, logistics, bases, and favorable conditions. Storms could destroy fleets regardless of their size. Technological advantages like Greek fire could offset numerical superiority. Control of narrow waters like the Dardanelles required not just naval strength, but also coastal bases and the ability to operate in confined spaces. These naval lessons influenced Mediterranean warfare for centuries. Nations recognized that sea power was essential for projecting force across water, but that sea power alone was insufficient without land bases, supply systems, and the ability to protect shipping from weather as well as enemies. The siege demonstrated that even dominant naval powers could lose fleets to weather, fire, or tactical errors. Logistics received belated recognition as warfare's foundation. Maslama's army had been enormous and well-equipped initially, but it had failed largely because supplying such a large force through a hostile winter proved impossible. The Arab defeat demonstrated that logistics determined military success as much as tactics or courage. An army could not fight if soldiers were starving, freezing, or dying from disease. Supply lines were vulnerable to interdiction, weather, and distance. Military planners learned to prioritize logistics. Successful campaigns required secure supply lines, adequate reserves, contingency plans for disruptions, and realistic assessments of what forces could be sustained in given environments. Ambitious operations like the Constantinople siege, which assumed that size and determination would overcome logistical challenges, were recognized as dangerous. Better to undertake smaller operations that could be properly supplied than massive expeditions that would collapse from logistical failure. The importance of alliances and auxiliary forces was demonstrated by the Bulgar role. Leo III's diplomacy in securing Bulgar assistance proved militarily decisive. The Bulgars had attacked Arab supply lines, harassed the siege forces, and devastated the retreat. This contribution, though often overlooked in accounts focusing on the siege itself, was crucial to the Byzantine victory. It demonstrated that even powerful empires could benefit from allies, and that diplomacy was a force multiplier. Leadership quality proved essential. Leo III's competence stood in stark contrast to the incompetence of his predecessor Theodosius III. Leo's preparations, his morale maintenance, his strategic decisions during the siege, and his diplomatic skill all contributed to success. Maslama, while competent, faced impossible circumstances partly created by strategic errors made before the siege began. The campaign demonstrated that good leadership could overcome unfavorable odds, while poor leadership could squander advantages. The siege also provided lessons in intelligence and counterintelligence. Leo's success in convincing Christian crews of Arab ships to defect demonstrated the value of information operations and exploiting enemy vulnerabilities. His intelligence about conditions in the Arab camp informed his strategy. His deception operations mislead Arab commanders about Byzantine strength and intentions. These intelligence successes, less dramatic than battles but equally important, showed that wars were won by information as well as weapons. Morale and psychological factors received new appreciation. The Arab army had begun the siege confident and well supplied, but had collapsed psychologically as casualties mounted and victory seemed impossible. The Byzantine population had maintained morale despite hardships, sustained by effective leadership and religious faith. The siege demonstrated that military success required maintaining friendly forces' morale while destroying enemies' will to fight. Perhaps the most important lesson was that overconfidence was dangerous. The Caliphate had attempted a campaign beyond its capabilities, assuming that size and power would overcome all obstacles. This hubris had led to catastrophic defeat. The lesson was clear: assess enemies accurately, respect their capabilities, understand operating environments, and undertake only operations that could realistically succeed with available resources. These lessons influenced warfare well beyond the 8th century. Medieval commanders studied Byzantine defensive techniques. Renaissance military theorists analyzed the siege in treatises on fortification and strategy. Modern military historians examine the campaign as an example of how logistics, leadership, technology, and morale interact to determine outcomes. The Siege of Constantinople became a classic case study in military education, demonstrating principles that remain relevant across centuries and changing technologies. Chapter 9: The Cultural and Religious Dimensions. The Siege of Constantinople resonated far beyond military and political spheres, shaping religious consciousness, cultural identity, and intellectual life throughout both Christian and Islamic civilizations. The battle became embedded in cultural memory, interpreted through religious lenses, and woven into the foundational narratives of both cultures in ways that influenced attitudes and actions for centuries. For Byzantine Christians, the successful defense was nothing short of miraculous. Constantinople had faced the largest invasion force ever assembled against it, led by an empire that had conquered from Spain to India and had emerged victorious. This could only be explained, in the medieval Christian mindset, as divine intervention. God had protected his city and his people from the infidel horde. The Virgin Mary, traditionally considered Constantinople's special protector, had once again shielded the city from destruction. This religious interpretation was not merely popular superstition, but became official doctrine. The Byzantine Church incorporated the siege's commemoration into its liturgical calendar. Special services celebrated the deliverance. Icons depicting the Virgin Mary protecting Constantinople's walls were commissioned and venerated. Hymns composed after the siege praised God's mercy and the saints' intercession. These religious observances reinforced Byzantine identity as God's chosen people, defenders of true Christianity against heresy and paganism. The siege also reinforced Byzantine apocalyptic thinking. Many Byzantines believed they lived in history's final age, awaiting Christ's return and the Last Judgment. Constantinople was seen as the last Christian empire standing against the forces of evil before the world's end. The siege fit perfectly into this narrative. Satan's armies, embodied in Islam, had attempted to destroy God's final earthly kingdom and had been repulsed by divine power. This apocalyptic framework gave cosmic significance to political and military events. This religious interpretation had practical consequences. It intensified Byzantine commitment to defending Christianity against Islam. Every subsequent conflict with Muslim powers was seen not merely as territorial dispute, but as cosmic battle between good and evil. This made compromise difficult and peace unstable. It also reinforced the Byzantine conviction that their empire had sacred purposes transcending normal political considerations. They were not merely defending territory, but preserving God's plan for human salvation. The siege influenced Byzantine attitudes toward military service. Soldiers defending the empire were doing God's work, protecting Christianity from its enemies. This gave military service spiritual significance beyond normal patriotic duty. Soldiers who died defending Constantinople or fighting Muslims were honored as martyrs who had sacrificed themselves for the faith. This spiritual dimension helped maintain military morale through centuries of often desperate defensive warfare. Byzantine intellectual life was also affected. Chroniclers and historians who recorded the siege emphasized divine intervention and moral lessons. Their accounts, while preserving valuable historical information, interpreted events through theological lenses. The siege became a morality tale. Faith and righteous leadership, Leo III, had triumphed over numerical superiority and worldly power, the Caliphate. These narratives shaped how subsequent generations understood their history and identity. The siege reinforced Byzantine cultural superiority feelings. Constantinople had withstood barbarian assaults for centuries, while Western Europe had been overrun by Germanic tribes. Now it had defeated the Islamic invasion that had conquered more sophisticated civilizations. This confirmed Byzantine self-image as civilization's guardian, the sole remaining bastion of Roman greatness, superior to both the barbarous West and the heretical East. In the Islamic world, the siege's failure produced different but equally significant cultural responses. The defeat was traumatic for a civilization that had experienced almost unbroken military success for nearly a century. Muslim forces had conquered the Persian Empire, broken Byzantine power in the Middle East and North Africa, seized Spain, and seemed unstoppable. Constantinople's successful resistance suggested limits to expansion and raised uncomfortable questions about divine favor. Islamic religious scholars struggled to explain the defeat theologically. If Islam was the true faith, blessed by God with military victory, why had Constantinople not fallen? Various explanations emerged. Some argued that the Umayyad caliphs were insufficiently pious, that God had withheld victory because the leaders were worldly and corrupt. This interpretation supported opposition movements claiming to represent true Islam against Umayyad decadence. Others suggested that God was testing Muslim faith, that temporary setbacks were trials to purify believers and separate true Muslims from hypocrites. This explanation allowed the defeat to be incorporated into a broader divine plan without questioning Islam's ultimate truth or destiny. The siege became not evidence of weakness, but proof of God's wisdom in testing his faithful followers. Some scholars argued that Constantinople's conquest was not actually required by Islamic law or prophecy, that the traditions suggesting the prophet had blessed the army that would conquer the city were unreliable or misinterpreted. This theological revisionism allowed Muslims to accept the defeat without seeing it as religious failure. If conquering Constantinople was never required, then failing to conquer it was no more significant than any other military setback. These theological debates had practical implications. They influenced how Islamic civilization understood expansion, military jihad, and relations with non-Muslim powers. The period of rapid conquest was ending not just for practical military and logistical reasons, but also because religious thinking was evolving. Islam could spread through trade, cultural influence, and peaceful conversion rather than military conquest alone. The siege's failure contributed to this shift in perspective. Islamic cultural memory of the siege was complex. Arab and later Turkish poets composed works lamenting the fallen soldiers and the expedition's failure. These literary works mourned lost lives while praising the courage of those who had fought. They transformed military defeat into cultural tragedy, focusing on human suffering and sacrifice rather than strategic failure. This allowed Islamic culture to honor the participants while acknowledging the outcome. The siege also entered Islamic historical consciousness as a cautionary tale about overreach. Medieval Islamic historians, when recounting the campaign, emphasized the dangers of excessive ambition, inadequate preparation, and underestimating enemies. The siege became an example in Mirrors for Princes literature, texts advising rulers on proper governance. The lesson was clear. Even powerful empires could fail if they exceeded their capabilities or ignored practical realities. For both civilizations, the siege became a defining moment in religious and cultural identity. Christians saw it as validation of their faith's truth and Constantinople's sacred role. Muslims incorporated it into narratives about divine testing and proper Islamic governance. These interpretations, formed in the siege's immediate aftermath, influenced attitudes for centuries and contributed to the deep civilizational divide between Christian Europe and the Islamic world. The cultural legacy extended beyond religious interpretation. The siege inspired art, literature, and historical writing in both cultures. Byzantine mosaics depicted the city's deliverance. Islamic miniatures showed the campaign's dramatic moments. Chroniclers on both sides produced accounts that, while partisan and often inaccurate, preserved memories and shaped how subsequent generations understood this pivotal event. The siege also affected attitudes toward technology and military innovation. Greek fire became legendary in both cultures. Byzantines guarded its secret jealously, while Muslims sought to duplicate or counter it. This technological arms race influenced military development for centuries. The siege demonstrated that technological advantage could be as decisive as numerical superiority, encouraging investment in military research and innovation. Education and intellectual transmission were also affected. Byzantine scholars preserved Greek texts and learning partly because they saw themselves as civilization's guardians against barbarism. The siege reinforced this self-image, encouraging continued intellectual activity even during political and military crises. Islamic scholars, meanwhile, began the Great Translation movement that brought Greek philosophy and science into Arabic, partly motivated by desire to understand and surpass Byzantine civilization. The siege's cultural impact thus extended far beyond the immediate political and military consequences. It shaped religious consciousness, influenced theological thinking, inspired artistic creation, and contributed to the formation of distinct civilizational identities. The battle that determined Europe's political fate also helped define the cultural and religious worldviews that would characterize Christian and Islamic civilizations for centuries. Chapter 10: Counterfactual History. What if Constantinople had fallen? History offers few certainties about paths not taken, but examining what might have happened if Constantinople had fallen in 718 provides insight into the siege's true significance. While counterfactual history must remain speculative, considering plausible alternative scenarios helps us understand the actual outcome's importance and the factors that made it decisive. If Maslama's siege had succeeded and Constantinople had fallen, the immediate consequences would have been catastrophic for the Byzantine Empire. The city was not merely the imperial capital but the empire's heart, containing its wealth, administration, the emperor and his court, the patriarch and church hierarchy, and a significant portion of its population. Losing Constantinople would have effectively ended the Byzantine Empire as a meaningful political entity. The remaining Byzantine territories in Asia Minor and the Balkans would likely have fragmented. Provincial governors and military commanders, lacking central authority, would have either submitted to the caliphate or attempted to establish independent kingdoms. Some areas might have resisted for years, but without Constantinople's coordination, wealth, and symbolic authority, organized resistance would have been impossible to sustain. Greek culture and Orthodox Christianity would have faced existential threats. While the Caliphate generally tolerated Christian populations as dhimmis, protected peoples, who paid special taxes, the conquest would have destroyed Orthodox Christianity's institutional structure. The Patriarchate would have lost its authority. Major churches, including the magnificent Hagia Sophia, would have been converted to mosques. Monasteries, centers of learning and religious life, would have been closed or severely restricted. The Balkans would have fallen to Arab conquest relatively quickly. Without Constantinople holding the Bosphorus, Arab armies could have crossed into Europe at will. Greece, with its divided city-states and lack of unified defense, would have been overrun within years. The Bulgars, despite their military prowess, would have faced overwhelming force and likely either submitted or been destroyed. The Slavic peoples recently settled in the Balkans would have been absorbed into the Caliphate before they could develop strong political organizations. Western Europe would have faced Islamic invasion from two directions: Muslim Spain in the west and Arab armies advancing through the Balkans in the east. The Italian peninsula, already threatened by Muslim control of Sicily and North Africa, would have been caught between these pincers. The Lombard kingdoms in northern Italy, the Byzantine Exarchate in Ravenna, and the Papal states around Rome would all have been vulnerable to conquest. The Frankish kingdoms, the strongest political entities in Western Europe, would have become the last major Christian powers. Charles Martel's victory at Tours in 732 might never have occurred if Arab forces had been advancing from the Balkans as well as Spain. Even if the Franks had won at Tours, they would have faced continuing pressure from multiple directions that might have eventually overwhelmed them. The papacy would have faced an impossible situation. If Rome had fallen to Islamic conquest, the entire structure of Western Christianity would have collapsed. Even if Rome had somehow survived as a Christian enclave, its ability to maintain authority over Western churches would have been severely compromised. The development of medieval Christianity, with its strong papal leadership and institutional church, might never have occurred. European political development would have been fundamentally different. The feudal system that emerged in medieval Europe developed partly in response to external threats and the collapse of centralized authority. But feudalism assumed underlying Christian unity and cultural continuity with Rome. In a Europe conquered by Islam, very different political and social structures would have emerged, likely more similar to those in Islamic Spain or Syria than to the feudal kingdoms that actually developed. Cultural and intellectual transmission from classical antiquity would have been disrupted. Byzantine scholars preserved Greek texts and learning throughout the medieval period, eventually transmitting them to Western Europe during the Renaissance. If Constantinople had fallen, many texts might have been lost or survived only in Arabic translations. The Renaissance, which drew heavily on recovered classical learning, might never have occurred or would have taken very different forms. The Islamic world would have been transformed by Constantinople's conquest. The city's wealth would have enriched the Caliphate enormously. Its strategic position would have made it a natural capital for governing both the Middle East and conquered European territories. The Umayyad Caliphate might have relocated its capital from Damascus to Constantinople, much as the Ottomans would do after 1453. Controlling the Bosphorus and Dardanelles would have given the Caliphate unprecedented maritime power. The Black Sea would have become an Islamic lake, with Arab fleets controlling trade routes and raiding Slavic and Turkic peoples along the northern coasts. The Mediterranean, already largely under Islamic control after the loss of Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, would have been completely dominated by Muslim naval power. The Umayyad Caliphate might have avoided the internal conflicts that led to its overthrow in 750. Military success often legitimizes regimes and reduces internal opposition. If the Constantinople conquest had been achieved, Umayyad prestige would have soared, making rebellions against their rule less likely. The Abbasid revolution might never have occurred, or if it had, might have failed without the discontent that military defeats had created. Islamic civilization's cultural development would have been accelerated by incorporating Byzantine territories and peoples. Greek scholars, artists, and craftsmen would have entered Islamic service, bringing their knowledge and skills. The translation of Greek texts into Arabic, which historically occurred in the 9th century, might have happened earlier and more comprehensively with direct access to Byzantine libraries and scholars. The religious landscape would have been transformed. Christianity might have survived in isolated pockets, particularly in Western Europe if any independent Christian kingdoms remained, but it would have been reduced to a minor faith comparable to Judaism or Zoroastrianism in the Islamic world. Most of the population in conquered territories would likely have converted to Islam over several generations, whether through conviction, economic incentives, or social pressure. The Crusades, which historically occurred in the late 11th century when European Christians sought to recover the Holy Land from Muslim control, would never have happened. There would have been no Christian Europe strong enough to launch such expeditions. The cultural and economic exchanges that the Crusades facilitated, for better and worse, would not have occurred. The later course of world history would have been profoundly affected. European colonial expansion from the 15th century onward depended on technological, economic, and political developments that occurred in specifically European contexts. If Europe had been conquered by Islam, these developments would not have happened as they did. The Age of Exploration, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, all of these world-transforming movements emerged from European civilization. Their course would have been completely different or might never have occurred. This is not to argue that Islamic civilization was inferior or incapable of producing similar developments. Indeed, Islamic science, mathematics, and culture were more advanced than Christian Europe's for several centuries during the medieval period. But historical development is path-dependent. What actually happens shapes what becomes possible later. A world where Islamic civilization had conquered Europe would have developed differently, with different achievements and different problems, but we cannot assume it would have followed the same trajectory that actually occurred. Some historians argue that Constantinople's fall would not have led to permanent Islamic control of Europe. They suggest that European resistance would have eventually expelled Muslim conquerors, just as Christian Spain gradually reconquered the Iberian Peninsula over centuries. This is possible, but consider the differences. Spanish Muslims were isolated from the main Islamic world, outnumbered by Christian populations, and faced unified Christian kingdoms. In the counterfactual where Constantinople fell, Europe would have faced the full power of a united caliphate with secure supply lines and reinforcements. Other historians suggest that internal Islamic conflicts would have prevented effective conquest of Europe, even if Constantinople had fallen. The Umayyad Caliphate's internal problems, which led to its overthrow in 750, might have occurred regardless of military success. This is plausible, but military triumph often postpones or prevents internal conflicts by unifying populations against external enemies and providing spoils that satisfy competing factions. What seems most likely, based on historical patterns and the specific circumstances, is that Constantinople's fall would have led to at least temporary Islamic conquest of southeastern Europe, and possibly much more. Whether this conquest would have been permanent or eventually reversed is unknowable, but the immediate effects would have been devastating for Christian Europe and transformative for world history. This counterfactual exercise demonstrates the siege's genuine historical significance. It was not merely another battle in the long Byzantine-Arab conflict, but a genuine turning point where history could have taken a fundamentally different course. Leo III's successful defense and Maslama's defeat determined that Europe would remain Christian, that Byzantine civilization would survive for another 7 centuries, and that the specific path of Western historical development that led to the modern world would remain possible. Understanding what did not happen helps us appreciate what did. The world we inhabit, with all its specific characteristics, Western Christianity's influence on culture and politics, European colonial expansion and its consequences, the scientific revolution and enlightenment emerging from European contexts, the particular balance between Christian and Islamic civilizations. All of this depended on Constantinople's walls holding in 717–718. The siege was not the only factor shaping subsequent history, but it was one of the crucial moments when the future hung in the balance and could have gone either way. Chapter 11. Conclusion echoes through time. As we step back from the detailed narrative of the siege and examine its place in the broader sweep of history, certain truths become clear. The Siege of Constantinople in 717–718 was one of those rare events that genuinely deserves to be called a turning point, a moment when the course of civilizations was determined and the fate of continents was decided. Yet it remains relatively unknown outside specialist circles, overshadowed by more famous battles and more dramatic events. Why has this crucial siege been somewhat forgotten? Part of the reason is geographical and cultural distance. The battle occurred in what is now Turkey, far from the Western European centers that later dominated historical writing. Medieval Western European chroniclers, focused on their own local concerns, mentioned the siege briefly if at all. They did not fully comprehend what was at stake or appreciate how close Islamic forces had come to breaking into Europe from the east. Another reason is historiographical tradition. European history has traditionally focused on Western Europe, France, England, Germany, Italy, rather than the Byzantine Empire, which was seen as Eastern, Greek, and somehow less relevant to European development. This Western-centric view marginalized Byzantine history generally and the siege specifically, despite its enormous importance for Europe's survival. The siege also suffered from lack of dramatic conclusion. Unlike battles such as Hastings or Waterloo, where decisive combat determined outcomes, Constantinople's siege ended through attrition, logistics, and gradual Arab collapse. There was no climactic battle, no moment when armies clashed and one side's victory became clear. The Arabs simply withdrew after months of suffering, making the siege less narratively compelling than battles with clear dramatic arcs. Additionally, the siege occurred during a period, the 8th century, that European historiography has often treated as a dark age between the fall of Rome and the medieval flowering. This characterization is inaccurate and has been revised by modern historians, but it influenced how events from this period were remembered and valued. Battles during supposedly dark ages seemed less significant than those during supposedly more important periods. Yet despite this relative obscurity, the siege's importance is undeniable once its context and consequences are understood. It stopped the greatest invasion force the Islamic world had yet assembled. It saved the Byzantine Empire at its moment of maximum peril. It prevented Islamic conquest of southeastern Europe and possibly beyond. It preserved Christian civilization in the East and removed immediate threats to Christian Europe in the West. These were achievements of world historical significance. The siege also demonstrated timeless principles about warfare, leadership, and civilization survival. It showed that superior numbers and resources do not guarantee victory if logistics fail, if enemies are underestimated, if preparation is inadequate, or if luck runs against you. It demonstrated that defensive advantages, particularly strong fortifications and interior lines of communication, can offset offensive power. It proved that leadership quality, Leo III's competence versus Theodosius III's inadequacy, matters profoundly in crisis moments. The human dimension of the siege remains striking across the centuries. Consider the Arab soldiers, most from warm climates, freezing in the harsh winter outside Constantinople's walls, dying miserably far from home in pursuit of conquest that would never come. Consider the Byzantine civilians inside the city, rationing food and watching from the walls as enemies surrounded them, uncertain whether they would survive. Consider Leo III, the military commander who seized power and then bore the enormous responsibility of defending civilization itself. These were real people facing real challenges, making decisions with incomplete information under intense pressure, experiencing fear, hope, suffering, and occasionally triumph. The siege was not abstract strategic maneuvering but human drama on the grandest scale, where individual decisions and actions shaped the fate of millions. This human element should not be forgotten as we analyze strategic factors and historical consequences. The siege also reminds us how contingent history is, how easily things might have gone differently. If Leo III had not seized power and prepared Constantinople adequately, the siege might have succeeded. If the winter had been milder, Arab forces might have survived in sufficient strength to continue the siege. If Greek fire had not been available or effective, the Arab fleet might have successfully blockaded the city. If the Bulgars had not allied with Byzantium, the siege might have continued longer. History turned on these contingencies, on decisions made and chances taken. Yet we should not see history as purely random or contingent. Deeper factors also mattered. The Byzantine Empire, despite its weakness, had survived for centuries because of real strengths. Its fortifications, its administrative system, its accumulated wealth, its strategic position, its cultural and religious cohesion. These factors, developed over centuries, meant that even at its weakest moment, the empire possessed resources to resist. Leo III's genius was in recognizing and mobilizing these existing strengths, not creating them from nothing. Similarly, the Caliphate's defeat resulted partly from structural weaknesses, overextension, internal divisions, logistics challenges of governing vast territories, the fragility of early Islamic political unity. These problems did not become apparent until the Caliphate faced serious setbacks, but they existed as underlying vulnerabilities. The siege exposed these weaknesses rather than creating them. The siege's legacy extended far beyond 718. It shaped Byzantine politics for generations as Leo III and his successors used their victory's prestige to implement controversial policies. It influenced Islamic history as the Caliphate turned from expansion to consolidation and eventually to internal conflicts. It affected Christian-Muslim relations, making the civilizational boundary between Christian Europe and the Islamic world more permanent and more rigid. The siege resonates even in our contemporary world. The cultural and religious divisions it reinforced still influence international relations. The question of Europe's relationship with the Islamic world, which has been debated for centuries, began partly with events like this siege that established clear boundaries between civilizations. The cultural memories and historical narratives that both sides developed about the siege and similar events continue shaping how Christians and Muslims understand each other. This is not to argue that modern conflicts are simply continuations of 8th century struggles. History is more complex than simple continuity, but historical memory matters. The way societies remember and interpret past events influences present attitudes and future actions. The Siege of Constantinople entered the collective memories of both Christian and Islamic civilizations in ways that still echo today. For historians, the siege offers rich material for analysis. It can be examined from military, political, economic, cultural, religious, and social perspectives. Each approach reveals different aspects of this complex event. Military historians study tactics and logistics. Political historians examine how Leo III consolidated power and how the Umayyad Caliphate managed its resources. Economic historians analyze trade disruption and financial costs. Cultural historians explore how different societies interpreted and remembered the siege. This analytical richness makes the siege valuable for historical education. It demonstrates how multiple factors, individual leadership, military technology, logistics, weather, alliances, morale, religion, culture, interact to shape outcomes. It shows that history results from both human agency and structural forces, both contingency and deeper patterns. It illustrates how events in one region affect distant areas, and how immediate military outcomes have long-term political and cultural consequences. As we conclude this account of the Great Siege of Constantinople, we should remember both its specific details and its broader significance. The details matter: the soldiers freezing in winter camps, the ships burning from Greek fire, Leo III organizing defenses, Maslama trying desperately to maintain his army's morale. These human realities should not be lost in abstract analysis. But the broader significance also demands recognition. This was the battle that saved Christian Europe from Islamic conquest, that preserved Byzantine civilization for 7 more centuries, that allowed Western European development to proceed along the specific path it followed. Without Constantinople's successful defense in 717–718, world history would have been fundamentally different in ways we can barely imagine. The Siege of Constantinople deserves to be remembered alongside Thermopylae, Tours, Hastings, and other battles that shaped civilization. It was a moment when a few thousand defenders behind strong walls, led by a capable emperor and sustained by faith and determination, held back an empire. It was a year when logistics and winter weather proved more decisive than enormous armies and fleets. It was a turning point when history pivoted and took the path that led to our present world, rather than an alternate path we can only dimly envision. Leo III Maslama, the Arab soldiers who died in the cold, the Byzantine civilians who endured the siege, the Bulgar warriors who harassed the retreat, all played their parts in this great drama. Their actions, decisions, and sacrifices determined not just their own fates, but the fates of civilizations and continents. They could not have known how significant their struggles were, how much depended on them, how history would remember their moment. But across the centuries, we can recognize what they accomplished and what their victory meant. The walls of Constantinople held, the city survived, Christian Europe endured, and world history took the course it did because, in that brutal winter of 717–718, a siege that should have succeeded instead failed, and an empire that should have fallen instead stood firm. That is the story of the Great Siege of Constantinople, a battle that changed empires and altered the course of human history.